I think it's time to start this session on higher education. We're in a very hot tent, which was very full just a few minutes ago, and I think quite a few people have rushed out to get cold drinks, as have I. But I think we'll start, and obviously people can feel free to drift back as they manage to cool down. But it's really fitting, I think, on a day like this and on a weekend like this, right in the middle of it, really. To put in a discussion about actually what we really do. And what we really do, of course, is higher education. And that was the whole point of founding the College for Women, to make sure that everyone who was able and energetic and enthusiastic enough to be able to study to the high level and to the high standards that universities expect. So what better session to have today than something on the future of higher education, especially in a collegiate university like ours. And I don't think we could have thought of three people better placed to animate this discussion for us than the three we've got on the panel. And I don't really think any of them need any introduction, but nevertheless, I'm going to do a quick introduction anyway. I'm absolutely delighted that our Vice-Chancellor, Professor Stephen Toope, has been able to join us today. I've got a bit of bio here, but you know, to be honest, it's absolutely huge and just as distinguished as you'd expect it to be. I note with a certain frisson that he was himself educated at is alumnus of Trinity College, but that's all right actually, because when Emily Davis founded Girton, she said that she aspired to no less than the heights and achievements of that college just down the road. And I think, you know, we're there really. It's just the size of the endowment that's letting us down. But you know, that's all we've got to fix. Of course, our own Vice-Chancellor was previously the President and Vice-Chancellor of the University of British Columbia, and he's held many other posts in higher education, including, for example, Dean of Law at McGill, and previously, before coming to this university, he was the director of the University of Toronto's Munk School of Global Affairs. So a fantastic and glittering career. His academic interests are in international law and human rights and international legal theory, and that really chimes with sessions we've had today. We've had a panel actually on law and women in law. As I said, somebody who couldn't be better placed to help drive our conversation today. I'm also very pleased and delighted to welcome Professor Dame Madeleine Atkins, who anyone who's ever dabbled in any bit of university administration will know as the Chief Executive of HEFCE from 2014 to 2018. So there's nothing that Dame Madeleine doesn't know about the way the higher education sector works, or at least the way it thinks it works in this country. Dame Madeleine is actually an alumna of this college, which is fantastic, and also an honorary fellow here. She has recently taken on Lucy Cavendish College. She's now the 9th president of Lucy, and a very interesting thing has happened at Lucy Cavendish since she went there. It's decided to go mixed. So our two colleges have a lot in common, being founded for women and turning co-ed, and there may be a bit of discussion about that, who knows. And our third panelist today is somebody, having read his work and some of his provocative, thought-provoking interventions in higher education, is absolutely brilliant to have in the room with us, and that's Professor Stefan Collini, who is a Professor Emeritus of Intellectual History and English Literature. He's done all kinds of amazing things in his academic career, and is a Fellow of the British Academy. He writes for the London Review of Books and the TLS and the Guardian and all of the things that you would read, but has really made some fantastic interventions into the big question of, you know, what are universities for? So three people brilliantly positioned to talk to us and with us about the future of universities. And what we're going to do is we're going to try and talk around three sort of sets of questions. And if you would like to come in towards the end of each little conversation, we're going to create a possibility for you to participate in the conversation, have an idea or ask a question, and we'll see how the session goes. Now, just one final little piece of housekeeping on the session. I'm just going to sort of referee a little bit as it goes on, but I am going to do a bit of timekeeping, because we have, after this session, got a performance in the Woodlands Court of Blue Stockings, which is the play which is about the vote in 1897 when Cambridge University voted not to enable women to have the degrees they studied for. It's a fantastic play about that vote. It's actually set in Girton. It was the most successful new play in the Globe Theatre when it was introduced there a couple of years ago. So I'm going to finish this session just about 5 to, so there will be time to, you'll just miss a little preamble, but the actual performance starts at 5. So we'll just give ourselves time, if that's okay, to get over there. So without any more ado, with our 3 conversationalists at hand, perhaps we could think one of the big questions of the day that certainly I'm always very conscious of, and if we've got any students in the room, you'll be very conscious of it all, is, what are students looking for? Are students in the conventional way that we kind of deliver something to them, or are they consumers looking at something from us? Stefan, I think this was your idea, actually. So, I mean, do you want to come in with a few comments on that?
Yes, I should make clear, only my idea to discuss it, not for that change to happen like that. I think it is true that there have been massive changes in higher education in the last 10 years, things that people outside universities don't always, I think, recognize. And one of the big drivers of these changes has been the replacement of public funding by high fees, and with that, a set of assumptions that people work with that can, if we're not careful, I think, I wouldn't say it's happened, but I say if we're not careful, I think this can drive us in the direction of treating students as consumers rather than as students, and encouraging them to think that, well, what they're really doing is shopping around in the supermarket of higher education, and our role here is to provide them with the goods we can at the cheapest price. There are lots of things about this to worry about. I think if it goes further in this direction, we could, for example, link that to anxieties about grade inflation and so on. We hear anecdotally about some students saying, well, I've paid a lot of money for this course, I expect to get a good degree and so on. Things that we would not, in general, I think, encourage or welcome. I think the difficult question is to decide on those matters where we feel student information and input and feedback are crucial, and they are on many things, it seems to me. Very many things about their conditions of life and so on need to be governed by a student voice. And any experienced academic teacher, I think, wants feedback about their teaching. It'd be foolish not to want it and to learn from it. But perhaps not to regard that feedback as the last word on what should be taught or how it should be taught. And the anxiety, I think, that is now fairly widespread in universities is whether the recent changes have pushed us further in this direction, so that we are starting to worry that the things we have felt to be essential for one or other course of education may, if they seem to be unpopular, and unpopular with the current generation of students, whether it becomes harder and harder to justify those things and to carry them through. So just as a starting point, I would say, I think it's an area of anxieties. I don't think it's meant we have yet turned students into consumers, but you can see why recent changes have pushed things in that direction.
What do you think about that, Madeleine? Because you've...
So, yes, I agree. There are some elements of anxiety in it. But on the whole, I think we should listen to students on quite a range of things, not least the quality of teaching. And I think the student voice is important there. And there is actually no excuse for poor teaching or inadequate supervision or labs that have not been properly designed and so on. So I think in that sphere, that's entirely legitimate. I also think from all we've seen of student surveys that what they most want are the things that we too may also most want. And that is things like having some intellectual stretch in their course, being able to look at things in new ways, being encouraged to have space to think more radically or differently than perhaps they had come through the GCSE and A-level mill. And I think those things are also important to listen to. It's not at all obvious to me that students just want to be spoon-fed, by the way. I would also, I think, add here that the word student now comprises many different types of learner. And the way in which we think about those who are coming back to skill or to upskill is, I think, rather different from perhaps the way that we're thinking about undergraduates in their first degree. Those who are learning online are going through a completely different experience in all sorts of ways from those that are being taught face-to-face in a collegiate system like Cambridge. So I do think the differentiation of the higher education sector is a really important second characteristic of the last 10 years, or perhaps the last 20 years, that we also need to bear in mind.
I was wondering how you would respond to that. Shall I call you Vice-Chancellor or Stephen? Would Stephen be fine? Thank you, that's okay. I'm thinking, you know, there's a fine line, or there may be a fine line in some people's minds between, let's say, challenging teaching and teaching that presses students to think in different ways or work in different ways, and then the quality of teaching sort of overlaid on that. Is that something that challenges you? Do you think we should?
I often think that this actually can get us down a line that's not terribly productive. I agree largely with Madeleine that in many ways, certainly the kinds of students that we have at Cambridge are looking for genuine intellectual stimulation. I don't think most of our students want anything that approaches spoon feeding. So I think certainly for us, that's not really the big challenge with the consumerist approach that I think, I agree with Stefan, has developed over the course of the last decade. Where I see the problem with consumerism as a model in teaching is that it fundamentally misconceives what it is that one does at a university. It seems to me as a student, you're co-creating in many ways the knowledge that you are hoping to gain as a student at the university. You're not simply sitting there listening to someone lecture. In our model, you're very much engaged with other students in supervisions. You're having people challenge you in a very direct way. And I think that's what's really important about education, certainly at a place like Cambridge. Having said that, I'm sure that most of us have been hearing stories from parents or students themselves at some institutions where there's almost no interaction with staff members. I was talking with the son of a friend of mine the other day who just graduated from a Russell Group University. In his final year, he took an option to write a paper, and he met with the person who was supervising him a sum total of twice. And that was more than half of his educational experience in last year. That is simply unacceptable. And that's why I think we have to really be thinking about this engagement model. One last piece. I'm actually slightly more worried about this than I think Stefan may be, because there's an element that we haven't yet touched upon. That's not the student-university relationship, it's the government-university relationship. Madeleine, of course, headed HEFCE. That has been transformed into something called the Office for Students, and in its legislation, it is now designed as a, quotes, regulator of the university sector, and the regulation is on the basis, in part, of consumer protection legislation. Now, I understand that there are abuses in the system. I've just mentioned one. But I do worry fundamentally that turning the government into our regulator on the basis of consumer protection could lead us down a very, very dangerous path. And I think we have to be careful to develop our relationship with the Office for Students in such a way that they understand the value of university autonomy, which is one of the other elements of the legislation that I think could get overlooked.
If I could just come back briefly on that, I just want to expand a point Madeleine made, which I think is very important, which is that I think as higher education expands in size in any country, from the ones I've studied, including this country, you're going to get more differentiation of types of institution. And probably in our discussion today and in lots of discussions around here, we have to be careful not to take Cambridge as the norm for these discussions about the national system. We are lucky in all kinds of ways. And I think in relation to this particular topic, that's true too. There are, as Stephen was giving an example, there are lots of places where this feeling about the consumerization of the process is much more marked than it is at Cambridge. And I think that's where the anxiety comes from.
Do you think there's any worry in that kind of consumer orientation then that, you know, that students are going to want things packaged in more portable ways. Is there some pressure to that, do you think?
Well, there always has been, particularly for those who are coming back into higher education to reskill or to learn something different if they're changing career and so on. In this country, there's been a long history of thinking about what's called credit accumulation and transfer. So that the idea that you study a certain amount in a particular institution, and then you can carry that, port it, as it were, to a different institution and not lose credit, that you can build your degree or your qualification in that way. And there are some positives about that model. I have to say, in this country, it's never really easily taken root. And on the whole, it's handled informally rather than having throughout the country a set system. The problems with it go something like this. The first is how long the knowledge is valid for. In some subject areas, you might argue that the knowledge is valid, you know, for 800 years at least, you know, the length of Cambridge, give or take. In other areas, which are very fast-moving in this 21st century, and where literally within 5 years the knowledge base has changed dramatically, then it is harder to justify the holding of that credit over time and then using it towards a qualification later on. Pretty much every Labour government and some Tory governments have looked at this over the last 25, 30 years. And it hasn't really taken off. Similarly, the online, what's called the MOOCs, the massive online courses, which have tried to disaggregate the learning process. So you get your assessment done separately from the actual modules, and you can knit them together from different providers. Again, hasn't really yet challenged the paradigm that we are most used to here. It may in the future. I think that's the question.
Does anybody want to ask the panel anything around this topic? I can see a hand there. We've just got a couple of minutes left on this.
59, so ancient. But there's a lot in the press, perhaps more than really happening, that people are unwilling to have their ideas challenged. And to my mind, that is a very real danger. Yes, there may be overstepping the mark in certain areas, but this idea of having a safe space for students to be and not have meeting criticism of some of their ideas, it's just total anathema. So how do the panel begin to cope with that? Because it could, talking about government looking at what's the paper saying, what's the Daily Mail making of this? It's a threat, I fear.
Thank you. Who would like to?
Well, I think it's a good question, but first of all, I think we would have to distinguish between those areas where a university has a legitimate duty of care to its students. There are certain forms of maltreatment or harassment or whatever which we would have to stop, and words can be a form of that. So it's not the case that anyone, as it were, can say anything. But I think you're right that the mood is moving further beyond that to the idea that anything that makes you feel uncomfortable starts to become controversial. And again, I would say, as Stephen said earlier here, I think mostly with the students in this university, in my experience, we don't encounter that very much. They're hungry to be challenged rather than the opposite. But I think there is a danger that once you get the atmosphere of feeling that we must only have what we're comfortable with. I saw a student quoted in the paper a few weeks ago saying, I don't want to hear that on the campus. Well, maybe therefore that's all the more reason why you should hear some things like that. I do think there we have to be quite strong and say the fact that something is unpopular or may upset certain people, once we've taken due precautions, is something that a serious university has to pursue.
Vice-Chancellor.
I agree 100% with what Stefan has just said. I would just add a couple of notes. Obviously, there are legal limitations around hate speech and around speech which advocates violence, etc., which we would naturally uphold. But beyond that, aside from areas where there is a requirement of safeguarding, as Stefan notes, I would say that it is absolutely at the heart of what universities are for to be places of discourse and active debate. And that will mean that people must feel at times uncomfortable. That's the whole point. And what we hope that students will gain from that is the ability to, in a sense, fight back, to marshal one's arguments, to really take on board the negatives that one feels one's hearing, and to challenge them back. And I think that's what a university must do. And you're absolutely right that there are pressures in our society to move away from that role, and I think we have to resist it fundamentally.
Thank you, and Madeleine.
So I would say one of the great things about a college environment is that it creates the conditions where it is perhaps dialed down, and one can indeed, with respect, as it were, or with more respect, listen to and challenge back. And I think it's one of the great strengths of a college like Girton, maybe like Lucy Cavendish, that we set the expectations for students about this kind of intellectual engagement and ideological engagement, and that we get it right. I don't think it's easy, by the way, because indeed, certainly in the college that I'm currently the president of, there are students who say, this is my home, and in my home, I can, to some extent, determine the environment. And that's an argument that we hear, I think, increasingly in the college structure. And if it's not challenged in a proper way, then that can very quickly become, and I'm not actually going to want to hear things that upset me, because my home is indeed a safe space. I suppose the other thing I'd say from my previous role as Vice-Chancellor in a very, very different university is that we spent a lot of time there. We had a BAME population of about 60%. We spent a lot of time working with young people about how you handle multiple identities in the 21st century. And I do think that's something that should be part of the co-curriculum, part of the way we educate beyond the tripos. These sorts of questions are real questions, and I think we have a role there to do something about that.
Yeah, no, that's a really thought-provoking question, and I'm sure it will come up again as we go along. But in all of these things so far, we've been talking a little bit, haven't we, about, we talked about the OFS and a little bit about what holds us to account and the different ways in which universities are held to account. So perhaps we should just talk a little bit more about that. I mean, have we got the balance right? The Vice-Chancellor talked a bit about university regulation. Are they is the government holding us to account correctly, or are there other ways in which universities should be held to account in society?
I'll just start by saying I think the thing that has surprised me most in arriving in the United Kingdom, and I leave Brexit aside, the thing that surprised me most is the extent to which there is very active governmental regulation of the university sector. It is not actually something that I am used to. In the Canadian context, there are very, very light touch regulatory frameworks. You have to have courses of study formally approved so that they're serious, but thereafter, essentially, the universities are left to get on with it. Here, there are many, many more circumstances in which government asks questions about very precise details of how we're organizing ourselves internally, what our policies are on a whole range of issues. Now, I am all in favor of accountability in the sense that I believe we are public institutions as universities. What I'm not as comfortable with is people who, frankly, don't have very much experience actually inside a university purporting to impose regulatory frameworks that I think sometimes, frankly, just don't make sense. And this country, and this is not a partisan statement because this has been happening over a number of years. I'd be interested in Stefan and Madeleine's reflections on this. I believe this country has gone very far down the road of highly intrusive regulation in the higher education sector, and I actually don't think it's healthy in the long term.
So you'd expect me to take a slightly different view.
Yes, I would.
And I would...
I'm trying to be provocative.
I thought you were. I would say this, that the Higher Education and Research Act of 2017, which is currently the legislative framework which governs the university and government interaction, has done a couple of positive things. I won't talk about the Office for Students, but it's done a lot of positive things. One is that it has enshrined for the first time the 3 fundamental principles of autonomy, which is that we may teach what we choose to teach. Unlike Canada, there is no way in which the government can say, I'm sorry, Cambridge, but I don't think too much of your course on AI. I think it should be doing something, a bit different. That absolutely has never happened and cannot, under law, at the moment happen in this country. We also have the freedom to admit whomsoever we choose as students, and that's a fundamental part of autonomy. And perhaps most importantly, we may hire whom we choose to be our academic and support staff. And again, the government may not interfere. And if you'll forgive me for an anecdote from my time as Chief Executive of HEFSI, we did indeed spend a lot of time patrolling the boundary between the university sector and government. So, for example, at no time in this country can a minister say, I would like this money to go to that university, which just happens to be in my constituency, or the adjoining constituency. We do not have that kind of pork barrel politics going on. And if, for example, a Chancellor of the Exchequer absolutely wants to support the North of England, and through that the University, shall we say, of Manchester, he has to do that in full public glare in the budget. And that then has to go through the scrutiny of Parliament. Otherwise, the funding, by and large, coming into our universities is mediated either through formulae, which are public and debated by the boards, or is done through an expert panel of academics. Now, it's not perfect, no one would claim that, but it does reduce the possibilities of government interference. And on things, for example, like the Research Excellence Framework, the tradition has always been that universities are told their results before any minister gets to know, so that there can be no possibility of political interference. Now, I agree to some extent. The thing has swung back towards the government. We're in a period of austerity. The public does fund universities, one way or another, particularly research. And there is therefore the question of whether it is legitimate of the government representing the taxpayer to give some general direction, let's say, around research priorities, or not. Now, there's controversy for you.
There's definitely controversy in the air here, so I'm going to look to Stefan to tread the ground there.
Well, yeah, I'm afraid I'm going to let you down, because Stephen and I are agreeing so much, we'll have to engineer a penalty shootout as well, try and disagree. I mean, I think the things about the broad framework that Madeleine said about the legal arrangements are absolutely true, and it's important to remember those. Right. But why it is that people within universities, by and large, feel as Stephen described, I think, is because through especially funding mechanisms, although you might say the universities are not forced to do something by political diktat, they are in fact told you're only going to get such and such a level of funding if you jump over these hurdles successfully in the way that have been defined. So I think the level of intervention that involves is something that presses hard on our educational and intellectual priorities. And of course, once you set up some such measures, the most recent one that was referred to, the Teaching Excellence Framework, the one already in existence, the Research Excellence Framework. Once you set these up, there's a very strong pressure, quite understandable and defensible bureaucratic pressure to make them uniform and to specify in great detail, oh, supposing one institution does this, okay, we'll cover that in subclause 4B. Supposing someone else does that, okay, we'll generalize that in the following way. And the result is, as we know, I was in charge of our submission in my faculty for the REF the last time round, is a document of vast size, which does, in all kinds of ways, press on our daily doing. So I think it's quite true that we have a kind of legal freedom, but I think our daily operational freedom is now much more under pressure than it was more than 25 years ago.
May I just say, do you think some of that pressure comes from the senior management of universities?
Well, you'll have to ask senior managers of universities that. But I would say that everyone is a bit stuck with this. I mean, there was I, much to the amusement of my colleagues, having been rather an outspoken critic of this, there was I in charge of making sure we did as well as possible. And I think most people, including heads of universities, are in a similar position, really. There are things that we do not agree with, but in the immediate process, we've got to do the best by our institution. So in that sense, I think senior administrators look like the people who are in some ways putting on some of the pressure. But the cause behind it is the machinery that has been set up, and that's on the whole been set up by government, I would say.
So what does the
I would only add that Madeleine's made an extremely important point, that the formal legal framework within the United Kingdom does support the principle of independence or autonomy. Absolutely agree with that, and it is extremely important that that's true. We know there are many countries around the world where that is not the case, and that is a very damaging circumstance. But to pick up on Stefan's point, I think what we're seeing essentially is not at the highest political levels, but at what one might call the bureaucratic level or the regulatory level, simply a piling on of more and more requirements. Started with the Research Excellence Framework, which has evolved. Teaching Excellence Framework, we're now talking about something called a Knowledge Excellence Framework, which is about transferring knowledge into the wider community, how that's done, how it's measured. We also have a whole series of issues that relate to how it is that our staff is understood, managed, etc., that really force large numbers of people within the university to spend inordinate amounts of time completing regulatory frameworks. And that part does worry me.
Could I come back on that?
Two quick comments then.
So one of the interesting things from a HEFSI perspective is that over 25 years, once what was the forerunner of the Research Excellence Framework called the Research Assessment Exercise, which was brought in under a Conservative government, we tried, I think, 5 times to say to the sector, look, this is ridiculous. It's large, it's cumbersome. Can we refine this down? Can we, for example, have a bit like one of these times? Imagine, going back through customs, green channel, red channel. If you actually want this kind of sum of money, then you just go straight through the green channel. You don't have to produce any large documents, etc., etc. And every time it has been the sector that has come back and said, no, let's try and do this as well, and let's put this bit in as well. And actually, there is something perhaps pathological about our sector that cannot actually bring itself to reduce the burdens of some of these things. And I just put that in as a slight corrective. And on the TEF, the teaching, the pressure for that came from MPs. It came from your MPs, the backbenchers, who had been in their Friday surgeries, week after week after week, had mums and grands and dads and uncles saying, do you know, my son, my niece, my nephew is only getting 3 hours of teaching a week on this degree program, and they're being charged 9,250 quid, and it's outrageous. And that was the pressure behind the introduction of the Teaching Excellence Framework. It was to bring universities, not least in the Russell Group, to heel, to take students and their teaching seriously.
So one last word on this, I think.
Just a very quick word.
If there is such a thing.
Just to say about this question of the reasons why politicians and officials have brought in some of these measures and the kinds of findings that Madeleine was referring to that MPs have in their surgeries and so on, I think it's very, very difficult in a case like this to generalize about so-called public opinion. Public opinion is figured in the media as being rather beady-eyed and wanting to control every penny, as it were, and not let anyone have any space. But the truth I find, I must say, in a very large variety of audiences around the country, is that people do fundamentally understand, yes, universities must be well run and the money must be used accountably, but they do fundamentally understand that freedom of inquiry is the key thing to intellectual quality in universities for both teaching and research. And I think that they can see in that respect, indeed I'm tempted to say perhaps you can see, that there's a risk that as that bureaucratic encroachment grows, as the number of sub-clauses multiplies, that area of that essential freedom does get reduced.
Yes, So there is a particular rub, isn't there? This sort of dreadful sort of trade-off between sort of the bureaucracies needed to kind of control and regulate what happens, and the reason we're all in the business really, which is to have fantastic cutting-edge, innovative ideas, which may have impact and they may not. I mean, that's not something we've discussed yet, and impact's important because that's how society holds us to account. But there is this tension, and to move on to the sort of last set of topics we're going to talk about, I'm going to ask the audience to come in first, because what does that say to you, or what do you want from that in terms of the future of the universities? What are the universities, and especially, could I say, given the event we're at, the Collegiate University, because colleges have a big role. So, but what do you want from the future of the universities? Because here you've got some people who are involved in shaping that future. Anybody want to come up with anything?
This one here. Yes.
Is there a mic?
Red.
Yes. Red. Yes.
Val Martin, History, 1970. I suppose what I'm interested in, was there ever a better period to be free at, if you know what I mean, free in terms of spirit at Cambridge to pursue all the things that you want? And if there hasn't been, has the change been partly because of the way student grants and fees have come into play, and also the mixing up of what people might have seen before as the kind of universities proper, and then what I'd call the former polytechnics, and then because they need more regulation, or they're not quite up to it, or they're different, the regulatory system begins to kick into play. So was there a better period before? Why is it so mixed now, other than what you've already said? And how do we make sure Cambridge stays top of the game for the next 30, 50 years? Because I really want to know where we're going to make it happen better.
Okay, I was going to gather up some questions, but I think we'll take that as a starting point, actually. Who would like to? Yes.
Well, I'd just say, first of all, that I'm not a believer in a golden age about universities. I think we should not be nostalgic. As we get older, we are naturally somewhat nostalgic, but I think not always for the right things. And there were abuses and limitations. But mainly, we lived then in different times with a much, much smaller university system. With the expansion of it, go to your last point of your question, with the expansion of it, my view is that we are going to have to think harder about differentiating the functions and so-called mission of different types of institution. What worked when you were sending 6 or 7% of the age cohort to university can't simply be multiplied and replicated when you're sending 57%, as we shall soon be doing probably. So I think that sense that in the future, some universities will probably be quite like they are now, and my guess, I have no better crystal ball than anyone here, but my guess is Cambridge is very well positioned in lots of ways to do well out of this. But a great many places will change quite dramatically, I think, as they have in the last 10 years, and new places will be set up to do other things within higher education. And personally, I would welcome that, rather than trying to keep to a kind of fiction that there is one type of institution here which covers the whole field.
So one size fits all is not the pattern of the future. And is there anything else that obviously is?
So I would say, if we were coming back here 50 years from now, what would we hope to see Cambridge being known for or fundamentally important for? I think we will have developed the most impressive robots and artificial intelligence of any university in the world. That would be great. We might have, and I think we will have been very good at the ethics of that development. That would also be great. This is a personal issue, which Stephen knows also, that I do think in terms of impact and accountability, we should be, in the next 10, 15 years, a university that really addresses some of those global issues, whether it's climate change, whether it's global health, whether it's illiteracy. There are several really difficult issues out there to do with equity and inequality. And I think it would be really good if Cambridge got its disciplines more together, its methodologies more integrated in certain ways, not just by setting up another institute, not just by setting up another institute, but actually thinking more deeply about the undergraduate curriculum, the postgraduate curriculum, and so on, around these big, big demands. Because our student body, if I look at what it's concerning 15-year-olds or 14-year-olds, 18-year-olds. I don't think they're the same necessarily as were the issues. Certainly when I came up to Girton, I'd just been demonstrating against the Vietnam War. Yeah, that was my gap year. That's not the gap year that students now are looking for.
Okay, but so we've got bigger issues. I'm just going to bring in, there was a question just at the back there.
Can I ask, and perhaps challenge Stefan a little bit on the differentiation of institutions? Because there is a country where there are many higher education institutions that are very different to the United States. And you have brilliant universities and you have community colleges. Wouldn't we risk to reinforce class distinctions and a tier system, which, coming from the left, would undermine all the work that we try to do to be more inclusive? Where politically should we stand on that? I can see the need, but is there not a big risk in differentiating too much higher education institutions?
Since it's addressed to me, I'll try and be very quick in the answer. It's crucially important in this country, I think, to distinguish questions of intellectual quality and access from questions of snobbery and social class. And they have been historically so intermingled that it is very difficult to keep them separate. But in fact, if we have proper systems of access and funding, there is no reason why the most intellectually demanding places should be the places which are only accessible to those from the most privileged backgrounds. So from the strongest sense of left-wing policies about this, I still think it's going to be to everyone's advantage to diversify the types of offering, which are not, by the way, all necessarily in a single kind of pecking order. It may well be that certain kinds of technically oriented institutes and so on achieve very considerable prestige and standing in their own field, but do something different from a traditional university. So what we've got to get away from is the idea that there is as it were, a single batch which includes high quality, standing, tradition, snobbery, and where I want my child to go, as it were, all rolled into one, and separate those out. In that case, I think we do not have to fear the outcome you suggested.
The Vice-Chancellor's got a comment.
If I could tie both of those questions together, 50 years from now, I would like to see what Stefan has just described, that Cambridge is not viewed as inaccessible to large swaths of supremely talented students. So one of the things we're going to have to work on together very hard, and the college system is crucial in all of this, is how we ensure that if you are a truly gifted person, you can see yourself at Cambridge. And that would mean that we would have a different social makeup at Cambridge over the next number of years. And I think it would also help to move to the position that I 100% agree with, that we must have differentiation in the system. Because otherwise what happens, and we've seen it, it's already happening, is that if you aspire to a single model, you still have differentiation. It's just on quality rather than purpose. And that's a bad form of differentiation, it seems to me.
Talked about different institutions. Is there another kind of question about the future? Is yours a different kind of question or comment?
Yeah, there's been more and more emphasis recently, over a good few years in fact, on the practical purpose of a degree. And the panel has talked about AI and about the ecology of the world, which are obviously desperately important, but where do you see the place for study of literature, of art, of things that don't have an obvious, immediate practical purpose?
If I could just start, I actually think this is probably going to be one of the important differentiators over the course of the next number of years. It seems to me that a university like Cambridge has an ethical and cultural obligation to continue to have a wide sweep of knowledge being investigated and shared and discussed. And so I very much hope that 50 years from now, we will still have very strong classics, and we will have Anglo-Saxon literature, and we will have history, etc. I do see, however, there will be institutions that most likely will be doing less of that. And again, that is already happening. Self-selection processes being what they are. And so here again, I think we have to look carefully at what the purpose of different types of institutions is, and understand that for some of us, it's going to be absolutely crucial that we maintain what I see as our cultural and human heritage. Others are going to be more focused on regional economic development.
Thank you.
Let me just give you one cheering piece of evidence, as it's not everything we talk about here is cheering. Over the last 15 years or so, I've been on quite a lot of panels, quite often with figures from industry. And one of the things that has struck me about what they have nearly all said, these are representatives often of large, even multinational corporations, what they've all said is, we don't want you in universities to be trying to second guess what we are going to need from the people we recruit. We don't want you to try and prepare students on today's business model, because by the time we get them, that'll be outdated anyway. The business world is very fast moving. What we want universities to do is what they're good at: stretch people's minds, widen their horizons, increase their powers of expression and so on, and then they will be useful to us over the long term. And I think if that view has any standing, then the subjects that you're worrying about are right in the forefront of contributing to that. And this is another place where it seems to me we've got to get away from a rather narrow media political spectrum, which focuses heavily on saying, oh, these subjects are useless, we must have more STEM subjects, we must have more vocational degrees. We will have these things for the reasons that Stephen said in various institutions. But there is a very strong, not just respectable, but very strong and actually relatively widely supported case for the role of the subjects you mentioned, which have indirectly as much practical claim as any other.
Okay, well, I'm not going to have to... Oh, yes, go on. One last question. There should be a... Yeah, there should be a mic.
There's a mic
There's
coming.
mic,
I'm
Juliet.
so sorry. Juliet Campbell. I was Mistress here.
Indeed.
Ages ago, it's beginning to seem, but it's wonderful to be
It was
back.
very relatively recently, and it's lovely. It's lovely to have.
My
you back.
question,
Yeah.
if Britain leaves the EU towards the end of this year, and probably without any agreement, what will the impact be on the university and perhaps on the colleges?
Do you want to start?
Okay, so briefly,
We need to be quite brief. Yeah.
and I'll be quite brief, and I'm aware my DOS is in the front row. I would say it goes like this, that in terms of our research strategy, we will be looking at other partners in different parts of the world, and that may not be a bad thing. We will be in and out of the Treasury getting support for those research projects that we wish to continue with Europe. We will almost certainly still have European students doing the master's programs. We'll probably see a drop in students from Europe doing a 3-year or 4-year degree, because they will be classified as international. That may actually, in turn, lead us to think about whether there are those super bright, really capable students in this country from areas and schools that have never thought about Oxford or Cambridge that actually we are now going to go out and reach. So it may not be wonderful, but it's not disastrous.
I agree. I would only add that we are going to have to be very careful and full of intention in ensuring that our international connections remain robust.
Yes.
Right now, because of the system that exists, there is a kind of natural flow that takes place through the European Research Council funding mechanisms, et cetera. If that is not replicated in some way, if we don't buy our way into Horizon Europe, then I think we'll have to really be working hard. And I can assure you we are. We've just been reaching a number of bilateral agreements with European institutions. The other piece that I do worry about is our continued attractiveness for some of our scholars. We so far have not experienced people leaving beyond a handful, but if money is less available, if they feel or their families feel unwelcome in the more general political climate, these are going to be issues that we have to think about very carefully and try to counterbalance within Cambridge.
And I would just quickly add that I think it's going to depend very much upon what actually happens in the years afterwards. We talk about leaving, but that's really only the beginning of the story.
Very true.
And it really will matter a lot what kinds of arrangements universities are working under. And by and large, universities are very good at fostering international connections. And I think we'll manage to do so despite a rather unfavourable legislative framework. The part I think that does worry us all is, will this foster even more of a kind of inward-looking atmosphere? Will it then make it unwelcome to people from other countries? Will that in turn increase our parochialism and so on? I think it's going to be less, frankly, the purely administrative or financial consequences, and more the consequences in terms of attitudes and culture that worry me.